Hey fellow developers, this is Manish and welcome to Frontend Interview Pro. So in today's video, we will learn in great detail about the new use hook which was recently introduced in React 19. So without any delay, let's get started. So now going to the code, here I have a very simple Vite application with React 19 installed. So please make sure you have the latest version of React, which is 19, in order to use the new use hook. Now, as you can see here, I have created few components beforehand, such as the comments component, the comment card component. So basically what we will do is show a list of comments, and this comments data will be coming from an API endpoint. So here I have created this fetch comments function, which is making that API call and returning the comments data. And if for some reasons we do not get any comments, we're throwing an error which says fail to fetch comments. So where does the new use hook fit in our example? So we can use this new use hook to read data from promises and from context. We will look into both these use cases in great detail. So first, let's see how we can use this new use hook with promises. Now let's import this comments component onto our app component. So inside this comments component, here is where we will actually call this fetch comments function to get the comments data. But the interesting thing is we will be using the new use hook to call this fetch comments function. So let's see how we can do that. So let's import this use hook, which is present inside of React. So import use from React, and then inside of this use hook we can pass a promise or a context, but in this example we will be passing a promise. So here if you see this fetch comments, since it's an async function, this returns a promise. So what we have to do is here inside of use hook we are passing this fetch comments function, which is a promise. So if you do not believe me, if you see, if I hover over this fetch comments function, you can see that this is returning a promise. So this is indeed a promise. So now what it returns us, the comments data. So just to keep things clear, we are calling this fetch comments function. We are not just doing fetch comments. And this is because only when we call the fetch comments function, we will get a promise. And this is because fetch comments is an async function. So if you do not know, when we use this async keyword, it will always return a promise, regardless we use the await or not. So let's assume we do not have all this and we are just returning some static data. In this case also, the fetch comments function will return a promise when it is called. So let's quickly undo this. Now if you see, inside of this fetch comments function, we are making an API call. So this is bound to take some time. So until the promise is resolved by the use hook, we can show some kind of a loader component. To show the loader, we can use the suspense component, and this will only work because we are using this new use hook. So if we wrap our comments component inside of suspense and pass a fallback that says loading. In this case, what will happen is until the use hook resolves our promise, this fallback component will be shown. Now let's see this behavior in action. So if we go to our browser and refresh the page, you can see that we have a loading indicator and then it says hello. So going to the code inside of this comments component, what is happening is until the use hook resolves our promise, we have this loading indicator, and once the promise is resolved, we have this hello string. So things are working as expected. Now let's see what more can we do with this use hook. We can now wrap our comments component inside of an error boundary component as well to catch any error that occurs while resolving the promise. I will be using the error boundary component from this React error boundary library. Of course, you can implement your own custom error boundary component, but just to save time, I will be using this pre-built component from a library. So let's wrap the comments component inside of error boundary. and we also have to pass a fallback that says something went wrong. Please try again later. Save. To test this out, what we can do is go to our fetch comments function and here basically write an invalid API endpoint. So here I'm just going to add one extra S here and then save. Now let's go to our browser and you can see that for some reasons it is stuck on the loading screen. So let's inspect and see what is happening. So if you see, we are kind of stuck in an infinite loop and we have a couple of errors. So the first one is of course this not found route, which is fine. And we have another error which says a component was suspended by an uncached promise. I can bet you this will be the most common error that you will encounter when using this new use hook without knowing it in depth. So now is the time to learn one of the most important concepts of the use hook. So going to our code, in the comments component, you can see that we are importing the fetch comments function and calling it inside of the use hook. So when we call this fetch comments function, we get a promise, which is fine. But now when the promise is resolved by the use hook, the comments component will be re-rendered. So please keep in mind that whenever you are using the use hook inside of a component, that component will be re-rendered when the use hook resolves the promise. So here in this case, initially we have a promise, but then once that promise is resolved, comments component is re-rendered, and then we have one brand new promise. So basically the previous promise is gone and now we have a totally new promise. So to fix this issue, we need to pass such a promise inside the use hook that remains consistent or same across re-renders of this comments component. In order to do this, we can go to our app component and inside of this comments component, I'm going to add a prop by the name of fetch comments itself. And here we can basically call our fetch comments function. So when we call this fetch comments function, it will return a promise which will be set on this fetch comments prop. Now going into the comments component, we can extract that prop out and basically call that prop here directly inside of the use hook. We can also remove this fetch comments import. So now here the main difference is that even though the comments component re-renders when the use hook resolves the promise, the fetch comments promise will remain the same because only the comments component is getting re-rendered, not the parent app component. So because of that, we will have a promise that remains consistent across re-renders of the comments component. So now if we go to our browser and refresh the page, you can see that we have our error boundary message, which means that everything is working as expected. So now we do not have that previous issue of just the loading screen getting displayed, but now we have the proper error boundary message. And this is coming because we have an invalid API endpoint. Now if we fix this endpoint by removing the extra S that I put, go back to our page, and if I refresh, you can see that we have our hello string back again. Now instead of showing the hello string, what we can do is basically loop over comments. This will give us comment and call our comment card component. Here let's give key as comment.id, and here if you see this comment card component accepts a data prop. So let's just do data and then comment. Click on save. Now if we go to our browser again, you can see that we have our list of comments getting displayed successfully. With this, you can see that things became so much simpler when using the new use hook, because you just pass a promise inside of the use hook, and while it is resolving, we can show a loading screen, and if for some reasons the promise fails, we can show an error screen as well. And once the promise resolves, we can directly use the resolved data to show some meaningful UI. Now there are a few more important points that we need to consider when using this new use hook. So let's see what are those. So the first one is that we can use as many suspense and error boundary components, but the catch is that while the use hook is resolving the promise, it will show the fallback component which is present in the nearest suspense, and the same goes for the error boundary as well. So please keep this in mind. Now, since use is also a hook, it can only be called inside of a functional component and other hooks. Similar to hooks like useState, useEffect, and so on. But unlike other hooks, this useHook has some special powers or characteristics. So let's see what are those. So the first one is that we can call this useHook conditionally. By this what I mean is, let's say we have a prop which is called isAdmin, and we want to show the list of comments only when we are an admin. So now what we can do is, if isAdmin is true, only then we call our promise and show the list of comments. Else we can show a message that says you're not an admin. Now if I save and go to our website, you can see that it says you're not an admin. And the reason is because we are not passing the isAdmin prop in the comments component. Hence isAdmin will be initially undefined. Because of that, we are in this else condition. But if I were to pass isAdmin as true, save, go to our browser, you can see that it is showing us the list of comments because we are an admin. Now if I pass isAdmin as false, it will show you're not an admin. By this you can see, right, that we are able to use this useHook conditionally inside of an if statement. Normal hooks like useState, useEffect cannot be called in this manner. Now we can also restructure this if else condition a bit. For that what we can do is, if we are not an admin, we can show this you're not an admin message and basically remove this if and else condition. Save, and now if I go to our browser, you can see that it shows us you're not an admin. It's because we are passing isAdmin as false. But now if I pass isAdmin as true, save, go to our browser, you can see that we have our list of comments. So it is working the same way as it was before, and by only using this useHook, we are able to make early return statements as well. Now secondly, we can call this useHook inside of loops as well. So for that what we can do is basically write a for loop that starts, let's say, from 0 and it will go up to 3 and then I++, and inside of this loop we can basically call our useHook and maybe print whatever data that we get when the useHook resolves a promise. So here what we can do is I and then comments. So this will basically print the iteration in which we are in and the data that we get from our useHook. Now we won't be having this, so we can comment this out and maybe return a string that says hello world. Save. Now if I go to our browser, you can see that we have our data printed 3 times with the index as well. So now you can see, right, this useHook is so powerful. So for the last and final one, this is not a feature but rather a limitation of the useHook, which is that we cannot use this useHook inside of try catch blocks. So let's see what happens when we use it inside of a try catch block. So let's just copy this and put it inside of try catch block, and we can also comment the for loop as well. Now if I save, go to our browser and refresh the page, you can see that it says use was called from inside a try catch block. This is not allowed and can lead to unexpected behavior. So this shows that we cannot use the useHook inside of a try catch block. So please keep this in mind as well. So with this we have completed covering how we can use promises inside of a useHook. Now finally let's see how we can use context inside of a useHook. So for that, here I have created a context called as auth context, and in the provider, if you see, we have this object with an isAdmin property as the value. So whatever children we pass to this auth context provider component, that children will have access to this object with this isAdmin property. So now if we go to the main.jsx file, you can see that this app component is the children for the auth context provider component, which means that the whole of our app component will now have access to this is admin value. But to get the value from a context and actually use it, here I have created this use auth context custom hook, which when called will give us this vary object. So let's go to our comments component and use that vary hook. So we have to do use auth context, and whatever this will return, let's assign it to a variable called as auth. Let's just log it and see what it is. Let's go to a browser, and if you see, this is that very object with isAdmin property. So now instead of reading the isAdmin value from a prop, we can now read it from this very context itself. So instead of isAdmin, what we can do is auth.isAdmin, and basically now we can remove this prop, save it. Now if you go back to a browser, you can see that this is working the same way as it was before because isAdmin is true. Now if I do false and save, it says you're not an admin, which means it's working as expected. But we are not here for this. We want to use the new use hook to consumer context and use it in our application. So let's see how we can do that. So basically what we can do is call the new use hook and pass this very auth context itself. So let's just do auth context, and then let's assign it to auth as well, and let's just comment the above one to prevent any errors. Now if I save and go to our browser, you can see that this is giving us the same exact value which the use auth context hook was giving us, which means that now we do not have to create this extra custom hook to consumer context. Instead we can just use this new use hook. And the best part is that unlike this normal custom hook, we can use this use hook with the context inside of if else statements and loops as well, in the same way we did it with promises, which makes it very powerful. So finally with this we have come to the end of this video. If you have learned something new, if you have gained some knowledge, please like this video, share it with your friends, and if you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. It motivates me a lot. So yeah, let's see you on the next one. Until then, take care and keep coding.